Our final speaker, before we then all get together for the Q&A session, is John Zysman. He received his BA at Harvard and his PhD at MIT. He's now a professor of political science at the University of California and co-founder of the Berkeley Roundtable on the international economy. He has published a great number of books and articles on European and Japanese policy, and he's obviously always traveling to those countries. He just told me he has to go straight to Berlin, then to Japan. So I guess very, very busy. And his most recent articles, they are on the future of work, platform economy, innovation, technology, and obviously the digital economy. So I'm very honored to be welcoming John Zysman. Welcome on stage.
With a last name, well, first, let me thank you all for being here. Thank you, Minister, for your kind remarks. We clearly share two views. One, manufacturing and industry is changing, and two, the global challenges are as daunting as you characterize them. Thanks to the organizers for having invited me, to my co-speakers today. I really learned a lot. The opening talks this morning also were quite wonderful. Having a last name of Z, I'm used to speaking last, which means I'm also accustomed to everyone having already said everything that I might have thought about saying, so that therefore I, generally speaking, try to start by thinking through what will everyone else have said. Reinhold Katz this morning and my colleague and friend Martin Kenney basically covered one portion of it, the speakers today. Some of the others' talks have covered much more of it, so I'm going to try and put this discussion in a slightly broader context. As I say, we tend to look at this coming out of California, Martin and I working together on issues of industry and software and the like, as an era of intelligent tools and systems, of which Industry 4.0 is part of that story. Now, clearly, there are an array of tales and labels. We've heard some of them now: platforms, robots, AI. The list is long: cloud computing. And lurking behind all of those tales are a series of really base technologies that are emerging with computing power, are merging with networks and the cloud. One of the projects we did decades ago was to take a look as networks were emerging, who was using them for what? What were they actually good for, and how were they changing industry and big data? And behind the tales and the base technology are an endless set of questions. When we first started working on these issues back decades ago with our friends in industry out there, they were the pioneers, and they thought they were creating a utopia. Some of them are still in the room here, but the people, Bob Noyce, Jerry Sanders, Charlie Spork, who created much of the semiconductor industry, really saw themselves creating a utopia. The skeptics were few. The skeptics are much more prevalent now. And there was also the question of whether the future of the digital era was over. Was it ending, or is it really just beginning and getting underway? So what I really want to suggest here is there are a series of stories that are intertwined and of questions that are intertwined. The technology trajectories and the business implications that we're hearing about. But equally important, the social and political disruptions and the emergence of a new global structure that would take place in any case, but in fact is being accelerated by the desire of my president to try and rip apart the existing system. So from my vantage, there really is what we would call the disruption conundrum. Can we shape the technologies, the technology trajectories, not just adapt to them? Can we create viable political economic strategies for democratic growth, addressing the disruptions in social status and structure that come along with these fundamental changes in how work is organized? And can we address the global readjustments that are necessary? So to begin with, I want to situate Industry 4.0 in this era of intelligent tools, because it's worth reminding ourselves where we fit. We would say that we're coming out of a second globalization in what we call the commodity trap, which is then resolved with intelligent tools and services with everything. Let me explain. The second globalization, the first globalization is when American grain hit the world market in the 19th century. The French and Germans responded by protecting peasants and producers. The Danes fed it to cows and pigs and created dairy farming. So it was a very different kinds of technology trajectories and technology implications that were involved. Second globalization comes with the creation of the world we've known it to be, and with it came cross-national production networks, a whole range of things, a decomposition of production spread across global structures, and the recomposition of that into final products and the like. But as production was decomposed, as new producers started to enter, we started to see intense competition at each node of the production chain. And in many areas, there was intense price competition, which is why we call it the industrial commodity trap. It also, by the way, created a development ladder by which countries like China actually were able to crawl and climb out of their purely agricultural traditions. So out of that then comes the question of how do you get out of this? How do you escape from pure price competition? Obviously, as we've been hearing from our colleagues in industry, constant, very rapid product innovation, implementing new and advanced technologies, distinctive niche products, particularly here in Baden-Württemberg with the very powerful small and middle-sized family-owned kinds of companies that do distinctive, specific kinds of things. Products that are embedded in digital services. In digital service networks. The iPod in the iPhone, in fact, value is created in a different and new kind of way. The product's embedded into a service network. And platforms emerge reconfiguring competition, what we call the rise of the platform economy. So the escape from the industrial commodity trap involves intelligent tools in everything. Intelligent tools in services, intelligent tools throughout production. It's a blurring of services in manufacturing, everything from contract manufacturing, contracted R&D, contracted services. And for me, one of the dramatic changes in the place of manufacturing products as such came when I was doing a talk a number of years ago in Helsinki about cranes and ports, because there are a set of companies in Finland that in fact sell cranes and ports, and they compete with Chinese. And as we all know, the national bird of China is the crane. There are more cranes in China than there are anywhere else. They're all are building. But in fact, this company, to compete with the Chinese, had decided what they would do is embed their equipment, which was heavily about port management, into software systems for port management. And they started to say, we're going to sell you port management services. Well, you can go buy cranes from the Chinese, but if you want your ports managed, you have to buy them from us because they contain the intelligence that, in fact, allows you to manage your ports differently, which is a change in the character, the link between value creation with product, physical product, and the software basis of it. So that, in fact, the other half of this, of course, is that we're seeing, and we heard this just now, the spread of digital tools throughout production, of which Industry 4.0 is one version of that story. Industry of Things, Industrial Internet of Things, another way of expressing the same kinds of tales. Now, this morning we heard two vantages on this, and they were referred to again. I think if you haven't heard the two talks this morning, I really commend them to you. They were quite wonderful. There's a story about this coming out of software and services out of Silicon Valley, and a story coming out of the production traditions, particularly in places like Baden-Württemberg, on how these things are going to be deployed. It's not just an American vantage on this or these talks, but there's this wonderful Fraunhofer slide that the traditional strengths of Germany are having to spread over into the uses of software, and that from the American side, the traditional strengths and software networks and the like are going to be deployed in production. But the question, and I want to spend the rest of the time I have now asking what are the consequences of all this? Because the reality is we know very little about the broader social consequences of this. Most of the tales that we read are speculation, hope, and fear. And when I say that, let's use the case of work and jobs. You're going to talk about business strategies and innovation in the next couple of days, so let's focus for a moment on work and jobs. What do we actually know? We know some jobs will be eliminated. We know some new jobs and new tasks will be created, and we know that most work will be transformed. That's not a lot. That's pretty obvious. What do we definitely not know? When? How fast is this going to happen? Some people say it's the day after tomorrow and it's a broad industrial catastrophe. Others say it's several decades and it's maybe more, and it's therefore part of a normal industrial transformation that can be managed economically and politically. We don't know what kind of jobs are going to get created or what kind of tasks are going to come out of the work that you folks are doing over the next few years. What we do know and don't know is how work is going to be transformed, how or what that will actually be. But take just long-distance drivers. Everybody's fearful in the United States that we will use automated vehicles, autonomous driving to do away with long-distance driving. Well, and truck drivers. Well, apart from the fact that most truck drivers don't like to be on the road all that much, and that equally important, there's a shortage of long-distance drivers. Let's set that aside. In fact, let's eliminate them. With e-commerce, we're going to see this vast increase in local deliveries, and drivers will do different kinds of things. You know, one of the drivers on a local vehicle drove into my neighbor's garden because he couldn't get out of the way. So maybe we ought to start worrying about skills and like in local driving rather than the autonomous drivers. So the critical point about transformation story is that there are multiple possible trajectories. And those will depend partly on demographics and partly on what we consider to be routine and complementary skills. What is routine and what are complementary skills? Let's focus there for just a minute. The standard story in policy and economic debate is that the middle income levels, the middle job levels are being eroded. Routine is being replaced by all of these wonderful tools that we're seeing. And as a result, middle income jobs are supposedly lost. And the complementary skills gain. Upper income folks like us, we all think we know how to manage these tools and therefore gain, will be the beneficiaries. But the only problem with that story is that the erosion is taking place in different paces in different places. Therefore, the question is why? What's going on? And the reality is that there are many forms of complementary skills. There are general skills, including digital skills, not just reading and writing. And there's synthetic skills such as narrative interpretation that are case-specific to your clients' and customers' know-how. They need to know how to use your tools, and they need to understand. One of my colleagues at Berkeley built a system for prosciutto curing, because it turned out there were only two things that you needed to know. One was moisture and the other was temperature. And so he's a great semiconductor engineer, teamed up with he's Italian, Alberto Sangiovanni Vincentelli. So he teamed up with a prosciutto manufacturer, and they developed a system for automating prosciutto manufacturing, which required general skills and specific skills, which is, I think, the reality of the future and how to combine those. So the issue is that creating comparative advantage is going to be central, but there are many questions. And the questions I have are, do the deployment strategies influence our understanding of what is routine? Or conversely, does our understanding of what is routine shape how technology is deployed? The answer of what is routine on a manufacturing line will be different in Detroit and different in Germany. I'm absolutely certain of that. And having looked at these things around NC machine tools and the like differently. And as a result, here there's a need for a different kind of skill and synthetic understanding by workforces as to what's going on the shop floor than there is in the United States. Do deployment strategies determine what complementary skills are needed? The implication is if you can shape the deployment strategies of firms, you can start to shape the consequences that these things may have. And I was very appreciative of the remarks the two speakers prior to me, the two speakers from industry were remarking, do judgments about the value of workers influence deployment strategies? Are workers costs simply to be gotten rid of, or are they assets who become part of the longer-term strategy of companies? If they're assets, you deploy technologies quite differently. And that's why Northern Europe, Germany in particular, Baden-Württemberg in specific, is so interesting to a number of us who work in these areas. There are alternative deployment strategies. And the question is, how do you deploy technology to preserve skills and preserve products that embed skills? As I like to say, and overstating this, Germany, in fact, and Baden-Württemberg has very little to sell except skills and embedded skills. So if you develop strategies that do away with skills, there's not a whole lot left. So that from an American standpoint, how do we push ourselves onto that trajectory rather than a different one? So back to the beginning, the stories of technology trajectories, there's social and political disruptions, and there's what I would call the third globalization now, not just because of the destructive actions and strategies in the current administration, but the emergence of China, the emergence of Asia, are changing the way in which the global system will work. But the challenge today is that more is at stake than just economic interests. Economic transformation always means social disruption. It's only in economics textbooks that it's bloodless. Economic growth and transformation over the centuries actually is involved with conflict and often violence. And the question is, how do you manage that? You need political and social bargains that are required for growth. The winners have to be allowed to win so they can generate growth for the society. But the losers, if they are simply pushed aside, will in fact try and block those changes because they will lose. Remember, never forget, the Luddites were right. They lost. The societies may have gained, but they lost, and therefore the question is, how do you handle that? But creating bargains in this era of intelligent tools and systems, I think, will be is very hard. And part of the reason is it's not just balancing the economic interests of winners and losers, but how do you maintain the respect, social identity, and position of those whose jobs have been changed and who require new kinds of skills and new kinds of positions? I think that's quite evident if sitting in Germany. I mean, even the reintegration of East and West Germany involved exactly that kind of social displacement and social reorientation, and was, I think, part of the difficult task that was involved. So as we come toward conclusions, these stories of Industry 4.0, production, work, society, are intertangled with resolutions of social political disruptions and of the global status and position and structure that's going to follow. Just to remind you that from my vantage as I look at this, we're talking about this era in a third globalization, the 19th century with ships bringing American grain across the ocean, the post-World War II era, the 21st century. So in conclusion, I would say the real challenge for this era, for Industry 4.0 and all of its cousins, is how do you have growth with equity? How do you sustain the growth of employment and productivity to assure expanding real incomes of the citizens, which is a sentence that Laura Tyson, Steve Cohen mentioned, and I wrote in a piece for a presidential commission 3 decades ago. It remains the same question. How do you, in fact, manage that? And how do you do it maintaining democratic normalcy and stability? Those are the challenges. Thank you very much.